Just days ago, meteorologists quietly updated their outlook for the rest of July, and the new version looks noticeably worse than what they were saying 2 weeks earlier. The heat, already breaking records across the country, isn't just sticking around, it's expanding, shifting, and in some cases confusing the experts who are supposed to see it coming. If you thought the worst of this summer's weather was behind us after the holiday weekend, the newest data says otherwise, and the reasoning behind it is genuinely surprising. Let's start with where things stood just 2 weeks ago. In mid-June, forecasters at Atmospheric G2 and the Weather Company released their initial July temperature outlook for the United States. They called for a fairly typical summer pattern, with the strongest chance of above-average heat concentrated in the northern plains, including the Dakotas, eastern Montana, northeastern Wyoming, and western Minnesota. Meanwhile, an emerging strong El Nino pattern was expected to bring some relief to parts of the Rockies and Great Lakes, based on how previous strong El Nino summers had historically played out. That was the plan 2 weeks ago. It is not the plan anymore. When forecasters updated that same outlook on June 28th, the temperature map had shifted dramatically. The outlook now trends hotter across the entire eastern two-thirds of the country, expanding well beyond the northern plains into the Midwest, the Ohio Valley, and much of the East Coast. In other words, in the span of just 2 weeks, the forecast for the bulk of the country got measurably worse. If you're finding this breakdown useful, go ahead and subscribe, because we're going to keep tracking this outlook as it continues to evolve through the rest of the summer. Here's what makes this update genuinely notable, and even a little unsettling for the meteorologists making it. Todd Crawford, Vice President of Meteorology at Atmospheric G2 and the chief author of this outlook, admitted the team is, in his words, a bit uneasy heading into July. That's not typical language for a seasonal forecast. Crawford explained that the current atmospheric pattern doesn't appear to resemble what's happened during previous strong El Nino summers. Historically, a blend of the last 3 strong El Nino Julys showed cooler than average temperatures, stretching from parts of the Rockies into the Great Lakes. This year, that expected cooling signal simply isn't showing up in the data the way it should. Crawford floated a theory worth understanding, even if it sounds technical. He suggested that this particular El Nino event might be so strong that it's producing what he called a kind of atmospheric range folding, essentially an unusual response in the jet stream and pressure patterns that doesn't match the textbook behavior forecasters normally expect from El Nino years. When the very people building these models are describing the atmosphere's behavior as unusual, that's a meaningful signal that this July may not unfold the way recent historical patterns would suggest. This updated outlook didn't come out of nowhere. It arrived right on the heels of a heat wave that was already breaking records across a massive stretch of the country heading into the 4th of July holiday. As of the days leading up to the holiday, the National Weather Service estimated that extreme heat warnings affected more than 102 million people nationwide, with another 43 million under extreme heat watches. That combined zone stretched from Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Missouri, Iowa, Wisconsin, and Michigan through Kentucky, Minnesota, Kansas, Tennessee, and Pennsylvania, extending into New Jersey, southern New England, New York City, and the Washington, D.C. to Baltimore corridor. Temperatures during the peak of that heat wave reached as high as 105 degrees in some locations, with the mid-Atlantic running 10 to 15 degrees above normal for this time of year. National Weather Service meteorologist Joe Wegman said the East Coast was looking at genuinely record-breaking numbers. When you factor in humidity, heat index values climbed even higher, reaching 105 to 115 degrees across parts of the Midwest and Mississippi Valley, with similarly oppressive numbers following into the Mid-Atlantic and Ohio Valley in the days after. What made this particular heat wave so dangerous wasn't just the daytime highs. Overnight low temperatures were staying in the 70s across large portions of the affected zone, offering almost no meaningful relief before the next day's heat began. Building again. That combination, brutal daytime highs paired with warm overnight lows, is exactly the pattern that drives up heat-related illness, since the human body never really gets a chance to recover before the cycle starts over. The impacts were already visible before the holiday weekend even arrived. Summer camps and outdoor activities across the Midwest were canceled as the heat wave spread eastward, and communities opened cooling centers to protect residents who lacked reliable access to air conditioning. Duke University's Ashley Ward, who directs the Heat Policy Innovation Hub, offered a blunt explanation for why heat waves like the IS-1 keep intensifying. She noted that the baseline temperature is simply warmer than it used to be, meaning that when a heat dome or high-pressure system sets up now, it's starting from what she called a hotter floor, which makes extreme heat more likely, not less, even in a summer where forecasters expected some El Nino-related relief. If this deep dive into how forecasts actually get updated is helping you understand what's coming, tap that like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep making videos like this one. Now here's where the picture gets more complicated, because not every part of the country is facing the same worsening trend. The updated outlook actually calls for parts of New England and the broader Northeast to end up somewhat less hot overall for the month compared to earlier expectations, even as the core of the heat expands elsewhere. Meanwhile, the desert Southwest, including Arizona, southeastern California, Utah, and Nevada, is now expected to see a wetter than average July, tied to the seasonal arrival of the North American monsoon. That's the annual pattern, where thunderstorms bringing strong winds and flooding rain become an almost daily occurrence across that region as summer progresses. But the news isn't good everywhere outside the east either. The updated precipitation outlook points to a drier than average July across parts of the southern plains, stretching from Texas through southern Kansas and into the Ozarks. If that drier pattern holds during one of the hottest stretches of the year, forecasters warn it could actively expand the drought conditions already sitting in place across parts of that region, adding water stress on top of extreme heat in an area that's already dealing with both. So when you put the full picture together, what's actually changed in just 2 weeks isn't a single storm or a single hot day, it's the entire shape of the outlook. A pattern that initially looked contained to the northern plains has expanded across the eastern two-thirds of the country, a summer that forecasters expected might get some relief from a strong El Nino instead appears to be behaving in ways that don't match historical El Nino behavior at all. And a drought situation in the southern plains that was already a concern now has a real chance of getting worse rather than better as July unfolds. That's ultimately why meteorologists describe this update the way they do, not as a minor tweak, but as a forecast that got measurably worse in the span of 2 weeks. When the scientists building these models openly admit they're uneasy about how the atmosphere is behaving compared to historical patterns, that's not something to brush past. It's a signal that the rest of July deserves closer attention than a typical summer outlook update usually gets, especially for the more than 100 million Americans who were already living under heat alerts heading into the holiday weekend. For now, the practical takeaway is straightforward. If you live anywhere across the eastern two-thirds of the country, don't assume the heat wave that dominated headlines around the 4th of July was a one-time event. According to the newest data, it may be closer to a preview of the pattern the rest of the month is now trending toward. Stay tuned to your local National Weather Service alerts. Keep an eye on cooling center availability if you need it. And remember the same advice that's been true all week. Stay hydrated, limit exertion during peak heat hours, and check in on older neighbors, pets, and anyone without reliable air conditioning. It's worth taking a moment to understand why a 2-week shift in a seasonal outlook actually matters this much. Because on the surface, it might sound like a minor technical adjustment. Seasonal forecasts like this one aren't built from a single model run. They're built by blending dozens of computer simulations, each one testing slightly different starting conditions and physical assumptions, then looking for patterns that show up consistently across the majority of those simulations. When that consensus shifts meaningfully in just 2 weeks, especially in the direction of more widespread heat rather than less, it usually means something in the underlying atmospheric setup has genuinely changed. Not just that forecasters second-guessed their earlier numbers. That's part of why Crawford's comments about atmospheric range folding carry real weight. In a typical strong El Nino year, forecasters have decades of historical analog data to lean on, essentially asking how previous similar years behaved and assuming this year will behave somewhat similarly. When a forecaster says the current pattern doesn't resemble those historical analogs, it means the tools that normally provide confidence are giving mixed signals instead. That uncertainty doesn't just make the forecast harder to write, it also means the range of possible outcomes for the rest of July is wider than usual, which is exactly why continuing to track updates matters more this year than in a more textbook El Nino summer. There's also a compounding factor worth understanding when it comes to how heat waves like this one interact with the broader climate trend. Research cited by climate scientists has shown that the average number of heat waves recorded in the United States has roughly doubled since the 1980s. That's not simply because forecasters are better at detecting them today than they were decades ago. It reflects a genuine shift in how often these high-pressure heat dome setups form and how intense they become once they do. Ashley Ward's description of a hotter starting floor captures this well. Every heat dome that forms today is building on top of a baseline that's already warmer than it used to be, which means the same weather pattern that might have produced a moderately hot week decades ago is now more likely to produce genuinely record-breaking numbers. For people in the southern plains, the drought angle deserves a closer look too, since heat and dryness tend to reinforce each other in a feedback loop that's difficult to break once it starts. Dry soil heats up faster and holds less moisture to evaporate and cool the surrounding air, meaning a region trending drier is also more likely to see temperatures run even hotter than the broader outlook suggests. If this precipitation pattern holds through the rest of July, Farmers, ranchers, and water utilities across Texas, southern, Kansas, and the Ozarks may be facing a genuinely difficult stretch, layering water scarcity directly on top of some of the most intense heat of the entire year. Meanwhile, for the desert Southwest, a wetter than average monsoon season carries its own mixed blessing. While additional rainfall is generally welcome in a region that depends on that seasonal moisture, monsoon thunderstorms in Arizona, Nevada, and Utah are notorious for producing sudden intense flash flooding in areas where the ground has spent months baked hard and dry. A wetter monsoon isn't automatically good news, particularly for hikers, campers, and anyone traveling through desert washes and canyons during peak thunderstorm hours. Taken together, this updated outlook paints a picture of a July that's more complicated and, in several key regions, more dangerous than what forecasters described just 2 weeks earlier. That's the real headline, buried inside a fairly technical seasonal update. Not that any single day will be unusually extreme, but that the overall trend has shifted toward more heat, more drought risk in some areas, and more flash flood potential in others, all within a pattern. The experts building these models are calling harder to predict than usual. If you want to stay ahead of exactly how this outlook continues to shift through the rest of July, make sure you're subscribed, because these seasonal forecasts are clearly still moving, and we'll be back the moment the next update changes the picture again.